Welcome and good afternoon and good morning to those of you who've joined us from across the pond. So my name is Sue Miller and I'm Professor of Music at Leeds School of Arts at Leeds Beckett University. And we're really thrilled and excited to welcome Professor Gayle Murchison. And before I introduce her, I'll just say a few words about this lecture series. So the mission of the prestigious Inside Out lecture series is to bring the best minds and thinkers of our generation to inspire not only our staff and our students at Leeds School of Arts, but also to open these talks out to the general public, the wider public. And to this end, we're bringing you renowned speakers from across the globe in order to enhance the cultural life of our university and also that of the wider public. So to that end, I'd really welcome your participation at the end in the Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question for Gayle, you can do so by sending your question to www.slido.com, which is SLIDO, and use the tag LBU-GM. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gayle, who's Associate Professor of Music at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, the United States. Her most recent publications include work on Nadia Boulanger in the US, music in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Woman, and on Mary Lou Williams' Girl Stars. And she's also the author of The American Musical Stravinsky, The Style and Aesthetic of Copland's New American Music, the Early Works, and her research interests focus on African American and African diasporic music, ranging from Mary Lou Williams, William Grant Still, and the music of social and cultural movements such as the Harlem Renaissance and the Civil Rights Movement. And she also works on the music of Zap Mama and Afro-European Studies. So she served also as editor of Black Music Research Journal for many years and is currently writing a book, which I will be buying, on Mary Lou Williams in Europe, 1952 to 1954. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gayle Murchison, all the way from Virginia, with her talk entitled Black Music Matters. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those in the United States. Close slide, please. Title slide. Next slide, please. In November 2015, the University of Michigan's Men's Glee Club, under the direction of Dr. Eugene Rogers, premiered Atlanta composer Joel Thompson's 7 Last Words of the Unarmed, a work for men's chorus, strings, and piano. Slide 3, please. In this work, Thompson set to music the final words uttered by unarmed Black men after they had been shot by police. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States experienced a period of racial reckoning following the shooting deaths of unarmed Black men and women at the hands of law enforcement and vigilantes. The subsequent calls for social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion reached leading cultural, arts, and educational institutions and enterprises. They expressed that they sought to diversify performance programming, exhibits, scholarly lectures, and other forms of public outreach. With respect to music, this included the programming, performing, and commissioning of Black and bebop composers and the booking of soloists and ensembles as Black Lives Matters, Black Music Matters, responded to Black Lives Matter. Admirable in intent, too often these efforts can and do evade uncomfortable truths. As the work of bebop composers and musicians come before predominantly white audiences, the latter must challenge their basic assumptions about not only music, but also about race, class, gender, sexuality, imperialism, and colonialism. While including the work of a composer of color or to program a black soloist or ensemble for a season, produces relatively little discomfort to do transformative work that brings equity into the concert hall, classroom, recording booth, media production studio, broadcast booth, and other sites of cultural production and dissemination requires commitment, sustained effort, and knowledge and examination of the historical past to understand how the present has come to be. Examination of selected works of 4 composers, 3 African American, 1 British, 1 woman, can serve as case studies and paradigms for moving beyond what can easily default to topical tokenism. Scott Joplin, W.C. Handy, and Mary Lou Williams serve as case studies of these prolific composers and performers, the children and grandchildren of formerly enslaved African Americans, engaged with the major African American aesthetic and cultural movements of their day, such as the Harlem Renaissance. They challenged racism and segregation, sometimes acting as entrepreneurs to overcome racial barriers to performances, publication, and recording of their music. British composer Selma Coleridge-Taylor, who served as an inspiration and role model for those coming of age around the beginning of the 20th century, also combated racism and colonialism, and his engagement with London-based African Americans and African American music shaped his ideas about Pan-Africanism and anti-colonialism. Discussion of select compositions and recordings by these musicians serves to illustrate the kinds of hard questions programmers, artistic directors, critics, educational institutions, performing arts organizations, performers, and audiences can and should ask about Black Music Matters. Black Music Matters, the title of my talk, begins by engaging with one of many Black freedom movements, Black Lives Matter, as we begin to think about Black music's past and what it promises for a collective future. Black Lives Matter is a political movement that began July 2013, followed the acquittal of the man who shot Trayvon Martin in February of the previous year. The phrase began as a hashtag post by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, and it expanded nationally following protests, following the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York. With subsequent deaths of Blacks at the hands of police, the movement grew nationally and internationally, first as a protest movement, later broadening to become a political movement over the next 3 years. Next slide, please. As a political movement, Black Lives Matter states its mission as a Black liberation movement combating white supremacy in all forms of oppression against Black people as it, quote, affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. The Black Lives Movement has music and musicians specifically identified with the movement. Notably, Pulitzer Prize-winning rapper Kendrick Lamar's All Right from his 2015 CD To Pimp a Butterfly has become one of the movement's anthem, sung during street protests. Next slide, please.
Tell the world I know it's too late. Boys and girls, I think I've gone crazy. Trying to side my face this all day. Won't you please believe when I say, when you know we've been hurt, been down before. Nigga, when our pride was low, looking at the world like, where do we go? Nigga, and we hate po-po, wanna kill us dead in the street for sure. Nigga, I'm at the preacher's door. My knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright.
Nigga, we gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. Huh? We gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright.
What you want? You a house, you a car, 40 acres and a mule, a piano, a guitar, anything. See, my name is Lucy.
Next slide, please. Monet's 2015 Hell You Talking About expands the media and cultural focus on Black men to say the names of Black women who have died in police shootings or while in police custody. As you reflect on the title of my talk, perhaps you wonder why I chose Black Music Matters. I chose the term in part to invoke the work of other Black scholars who have organized conferences, published articles, and edited books on the music of Black Lives Matters, such as Fernando Orejuela and Stephanie Shonikan's 2018 Black Lives Matter and Music, Protest, Intervention, Reflection, in which they directly engage with the movement. In her foreword, leading African-American music scholar Portia Malsby states explicitly how African-American music has been used as a form of resistance. Quote, for centuries, various ethnic, cultural, and social groups throughout the world have used music as a form of resistance against dictatorial rulers, oppressive governments, and capitalist structures. Folklorists, ethnomusicologists, African-Americanists, cultural historians, and cultural sociologists have long recognized the power of music to empower people, to galvanize them into political action, and to sustain social movements. I also chose Black Music Matters because of the word matters. It resonates with Black culture and invokes the phrase Black parents ask their children, what's the matter? As they hold space to listen to the child and both comfort and pass on from one generation to the next sage advice and important survival and wellness skills. The title also plays with questions of, when it comes to Black music, what matters, who matters, and why does it matter? Or even what is the matter? If we, in stating Black music matters, are asking questions about Black music, well then, what exactly are those questions? Next slide, please. Black music matters? If Black music matters, what about Black music matters? And what is the matter with Black music in the sense of physics and the law of conservation of matter and energy? To answer these questions, it requires us to roll all questions into one, and that is Black music matters because Black lives matters, or to state more explicitly, Black music has always reflected the lives and conditions of Black people. To paraphrase what Amiri Baraka wrote in his foundational text, Blues People, the history of Black Americans and Black people all around the world has been one of a constant struggle for freedom, as Malsby continues to instruct us. With respect to Black people in the United States, this struggle has involved four major freedom movements from, next slide please. 1. Abolition, the struggle to abolish slavery. 2. Emancipation, those post-Civil War years that are marked by Reconstruction and, after its failure, legalized segregation and what is commonly called Jim Crow. 3. The Niagara Movement, which led to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, an organization that led the early 20th century struggle for civil rights and combated racism. 4. The post-World War II civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. 5. The Black arts and Black power movements of the late 1960s to the 1970s. 6. The hip-hop movement of the 1980s and 1990s to 5, most recently, the Black Lives Matters movement. Each one of these correlates to specific eras and genres of Black music, both songs and repertoire directly linked to each, as well as musics that were part of Black Americans' daily lives and reflect their ways of knowing, being, living, and moving in a world where racism and racial violence circumscribe our lives. Each movement, each decisive period in Black history, culture, and life has its music, its soundtrack. Next slide, please. This chart is a bit of an oversimplification, for it leads one to believe that certain musical genres and traditions ended with a specific decade or is linked merely to one movement, one era, and so forth, when that is not the case at all. Genres and practices evolve, and there are regional and city, even community-specific practices. Rather, this chart outlines how new musical developments occurred concurrent with social movements, Black resistance, and cultural change. And that is indeed what Black musicians, composers, audience, critics, scholars, and all those who are creators and culture bearers of Black music know and have passed on from generation to generation. Black music matters, or the matter and matters of Black music, as well as the how and why. I've chosen these 4 Black musicians to explore Black music matters. Next slide, please. Scott Joplin, W.C. Handy, Mary Lou Williams, and later Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Next slide, please. Here we can see there that these generations correspond to what I refer to as the generations in freedom. 3 of these are African Americans who worked in African American vernacular musical traditions, and one, Coleridge Taylor, is a Black British composer who worked in the British classical music tradition. My interest is less to explore musical style and genres alone. Rather, I wish to explore how the condition and times in which they lived and the social movements led to ways in which they used their music to challenge racist and racialized assumptions and to work for Black liberation. Doing this requires we ask questions about race, slavery, civil rights, immigration, imperialism, colonialism, class, and gender. With respect to the 3 African Americans, W.C. Handy, Scott Joplin, and Mary Lou Williams, one thing they all share in common is that they were the children and grandchildren of formerly enslaved parents or grandparents. Here I want to borrow from historian Ira Berlin's Generations of Captivity from 2003. In this study of 3 centuries of slavery in the United States, rather than taking a strictly chronological approach, Berlin parsed the history of the enslaved into generations. Charter generation, the era of the initial contact between Africans and Europeans at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th and 16th centuries. Plantation generations, the revolutionary generation of the late 18th century. Migration generations from 1810 to 1861, and the freedom generation, those born or who came of age in 1861 or during the Civil War. With respect to the generation of musicians who came of age between the end of the U.S. Civil War and World War II, I also wish to see them as generations in freedom, beginning where Berlin left off. The Emancipation generation, the Plessy generation after Homer Plessy, and the 19-teens Harlem Renaissance generation. The Emancipation generation are those who were born in the years after the U.S. Civil War, which ended in 1865. The members of this generation grew up during the promise and failure of Reconstruction and reached adulthood in the 1880s and 1890s. As we can see from the chart, each of these musicians came of age during crucial years in African American history, during crucial stages in Black musician resistance, as African Americans moved from captivity to freedom, and they sought education that had systemically and legally been denied to them during enslavement and during post-Reconstruction, and as they migrated first from the rural countryside to southern cities in search of economic opportunities, and then from the south to the north, both to find opportunities and to escape racial terrorism. Each generation created and enjoyed its own music, one that reflected their lives and condition and served as actors of resistance, if only to show how emancipated Blacks and their children and grandchildren thrived and survived the cruel and crushing institution of chattel slavery. Each of these Black American musicians made major contributions to the music of their generation and to African American music and global music in general, and each in his own way resisted all forms of oppression, whether through overt activism, overt protest and social commentary readily apparent in his or her music, or in other ways in which they use their music and their work as composers and musicians to resist and push back against oppression and built enduring musical legacies and institutions. We begin with Scott Joplin, commonly referred to as the King of Ragtime. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Scott Joplin represents the Emancipation generation composer. Born in 1868 in Texarkana, Texas, to a formerly enslaved father and freeborn mother, both of whom were musical, Joplin grew up in poverty in Texarkana, Arkansas. After emancipation, newly emancipated former slaves and freeborn persons sought formal education, if not for themselves, then for their children. In addition to receiving musical instruction from his mother, Joplin also studied with a German immigrant musician frequently identified as Julius Weiss. Joplin's father eventually found work as a manual laborer and railroad worker, but in much of Arkansas and other parts of the South, sharecropping and manual labor were among the few employment opportunities available to black men. Sharecropping, the system that replaced slavery, was particularly oppressive. Rather than pay laborers cash wages, sharecropping turned on debt peonage, keeping black women and men and their families constantly in debt to a white landowner, with little or no hope of escape from poverty, nor the accumulation of enough cash to meet basic needs. For many men during the late 19th and early 20th century, becoming an itinerant professional musician was a viable option. Thus, Joplin's agency and choice to pursue music as a profession pushed back against and served as an act of resistance to this oppressive economic system. His musical activities were quite varied. He taught, composed, performed, and led a band. Having toured with his own vocal quartet in 1893 and 1894, Joplin settled in Sedalia, Missouri to teach. He also played cornet in the African-American Queen City Cornet Band and performed with his own dance band. After studying music at George R. Smith College, he began teaching piano and composition to other ragtime composers. He continued to teach and compose after marrying and moving to St. Louis in 1901. Though known today as a ragtime composer, he also composed opera. His first, now lost, was A Guest of Honor, based on an actual historical event, President Theodore Roosevelt's White House October 16, 1901 dinner with African-American leader Booker T. Washington. Joplin's second opera, Treemonisha, survived. Treemonisha shows another facet of Joplin's work as entrepreneur, specifically as music publisher. In 1907, Joplin moved to New York, hoping without success to find a publisher for Treemonisha, which he completed in 1910. He ended up publishing the work himself in 1911. Until he was physically incapacitated, Joplin unsuccessfully sought to secure enough funding to underwrite a fully staged production of this opera. The first performance of Treemonisha occurred more than 50 years after his death, in January 1972, at the historically black college Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Let's explore Joplin's opera and what they mean, and why and how they matter. Both are about black uplift and advancement, an ideology that was referred to by contemporaries and later as racial uplift. This concept means the improvement of the lives and conditions of African Americans through education, industrious labor, entrepreneurship, and economic advancement. Often, the two major leaders of the era are juxtaposed, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, as representative of racial uplift. A leader of Tuskegee Institute and later university, Washington founded the National Negro Business League in 1900, which reflected his belief that black economic advancement could be achieved through entrepreneurship and business ownership, and this would lead to a solution to racism. Du Bois held the opposing view that education and working actively for civil and voting rights would solve the United States' racial problems, an ideology that has come to be known as the Talented Tenth. Treemonisha reflects both ideals in myriad ways. It focuses on an African American community rising from enslavement, still residing on a plantation near Texarkana after the Civil War. A child is found abandoned under a tree by Monisha, who names her tree Monisha. The educated, the adult Treemonisha, is abducted by the conjurer Zazadre. This opera, in short, is about the importance of education and good leadership, expressed in an aria and chorus, "We Will Trust You as Our Leader," sung by Treemonisha near the end of the third and final act. If you'll bear with us, we've had a little bit of a technical difficulty, and if you'll please play the video at 1 hour and approximately 8 seconds.
We ought to have only one in our neighborhood, an energetic leader to follow for our good. The ignorant too long have ruled. I told.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. The Plessy generation faced different matters. This generation had new opportunities to acquire formal education, including higher education, as the number of Black colleges and institutes had increased significantly in the decades following the Civil War. While the mass of African Americans in southern states fought poverty, they strove to build schools and educate themselves and their children. Some acquired property or founded small businesses. This generation of African Americans increasingly founded their own institutions, not only educational, but also financial, legal, religious, and entertainment in all sectors of Black life. Yet, the color line hardened and racial violence increased after the failure of Reconstruction. And educational and economic advancements that African Americans had made were threatened. Those born in the late 1880s and 1890s saw or grew up in the era during which the landmark 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court handed down the decision, quote, separate but equal, close quote, which established segregation, also known as Jim Crow, as the law of the land. Racial discrimination was now legally enshrined with separate facilities and institutions for Blacks and whites. Most egregiously, Southern states flew in direct and willful, flagrant violation of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution of 1870, which stated in Section 1, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, close quotation. This generation saw its newly constitutionally guaranteed rights stripped away. This all mattered greatly to William Christopher Handy, who became, to his father's chagrin, a musician and then later a successful entrepreneur and songwriter and music publisher. As an activist and as one of the most successful businessmen and racemen of the early 20th century. Known popularly as the father of the blues, Handy was born into a religious family of formerly enslaved parents. Unlike Joplin, whose parents were musical, Handy's pastor father believed that secular instrumental music was devil's music and discouraged his son's musical activities, except for the formal and classical music that Handy studied in school. Like others of their generation, Handy's parents embraced industry, thrift, faith, and education as a path to entry into the middle class. In 1892, Handy passed his teacher's exam and briefly taught at what is now Alabama A&M University in Normal, Alabama. To become a school teacher at the same college where the father of Handy's mentee and friend, composer William Grant Still, had taught mathematics and music. Like Joplin, Handy had worked manual labor jobs, and like Joplin, Handy found that music offered him greater opportunities. Having joined a minstrel show and touring as a performer and band leader with Mahara's Colored Minstrels, he tired of touring and returned to Florence before taking a job as a leader of a brass band in Memphis, the Knights of Pythias. It's a well-known story that initially Handy's musical success came once he realized that the blues, which was popular with both blacks and whites in the Mississippi Delta area and Memphis, could be profitable. He then embarked on a career as a songwriter and composer. In all capacities, Andy thoroughly embraced Booker T. Washington's call to, quote, cast down your buckets where you are, close quote, as he became entrepreneur, first as a band leader and then as a songwriter, and equally notably as a black businessman in the field of music publishing. After selling his first popular tune, Mr. Crump, known as the Memphis Blues, Handy, along with a young banker and former Atlanta University associate of Du Bois, formed a music publishing company, Pace and Handy. His published blues, which combined ragtime and blues, disseminated African American blues to both black and white audiences throughout the United States and internationally. His blues songs also became an important part of the jazz repertoire. Next song, please. As a race man, if we can hold off just a second, please. As a race man, Handy understood that it was his duty to serve the African American community. Yes, please, go ahead and please play St. Louis Blues.
I hate to see the evening sun go down. I hate to see the evening sun go down. It makes me think on my last go round. St. Louis.
As a race man, Handy understood that it was his duty to serve the African American community. He employed a black staff, musical and clerical. He did business with a black-owned bank when he was in Memphis. In addition to his songs, he also wrote books, including one about the blues in which he anthologized several blues and sought to theorize about the music. Handy dared to publish songs that went beyond entertaining blues and popular songs or the edifying arrangements of spirituals. He published songs that celebrated African American achievement. And in publishing U.B. Blake's 1941 We Are Americans Too, Handy Brothers Publishing Company was willing to stand up for and support the demand for the African Americans' full citizenship. Please play the song, please.
By the record we've made and the part that we've played, we are Americans too. By the pick and the plow and the sweat of our brow, we are Americans too. We have given up our blood and bone, helped to lay the nation's cornerstone. None have loved Old Glory more than we.
Gender is also a part of Black Music Matters, for Black girls matter and Black women matter. Janelle Monáe's Hell You Talking About calls out that Black women too have lost their lives, and it matters that they too get justice. The music of Black women matters, for the music of Mary Lou Williams matters. A child prodigy, Williams is best known as a jazz pianist who lived and played through all eras of jazz. She also found success as a composer and arranger and pianist with Andy Kirk's Clouds of Joy, a Kansas City-based swing band. Yet, Williams practiced her own form of activism all throughout her career. First, she resisted any attempt to label her and limit her as a girl pianist or to discriminate against her on the basis of gender. Second, she was a member of the Harlem Renaissance generation. The Harlem Renaissance generation were those who were born around the turn of the 20th century and who came of age during this movement. The Harlem Renaissance is generally viewed as a cultural movement, yet this is a simplified view, as expressed by its major intellectuals such as philosopher and Howard University professor Alan Locke, and Former professor and head of the NAACP and one of the founders of Pan-Africanism, Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance was also a social and political movement that had as its ultimate aim the goal of combating racism and ending segregation, partly through cultural production and cultural activism, in that by educating white Americans about the culture of African Americans that would further race relation and promote interracial understanding. Jazz was the music of the Harlem Renaissance and the 1920s and 1930s. It was an urban music that, like blacks in the early 20th century, had migrated out of the South. It was a music that embraced urban possibilities, including new technological possibilities of sound recording, radio, and film. This brings up the issue of agency and labor and capitalism. Mary Lou Williams had to struggle against both sexism and racism as a female composer and as a recording artist. She pushed back against her record companies who sought to cheat her out of her royalties, and she also sought to maintain control of her copyright, which of course would secure her income by providing her with royalties. Mary Lou Williams also engaged in her own form of activism to push back against Jim Crow. In the late 1940s, encouraged by Leonard Feather, who acted as a producer for several sessions in 1946 and 1947, Mary Lou Williams went into the studio with several white women jazz musicians, and they recorded under the name Mary Lou Williams Girl Stars. Next slide, please. This is an example we see on the left, Mary Lou Williams and her bass player, and then on the right, we see Mary Lou Williams with Mary Osborne, who was a white guitarist. Please play the selection. This is an oral selection. In this selection, we hear Mary Lou Williams acting as both composer and as leader on this ensemble. In short, it is a black woman, Williams, who employs as her side musicians an ensemble of white women. What is the matter with our final composer, Samuel Coleridge Taylor? He contrasts the other three in that he is Black British rather than African American. And while neither he nor his father experienced transatlantic chattel slavery, Coleridge Taylor was aware of his status as the son of an African doctor and white English nurse. This identity shaped his worldview and his compositional choices. And like his counterparts in the United States, he used his music to make social commentary and to resist. In this case, Coleridge Taylor explored concepts of diaspora, linking Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. He also challenged British imperialism and colonialism, and he was one of the early activists engaged in Pan-Africanism. In 24 Negro Melodies, these seemingly disparate strands, also including opposition to war and anti-imperialism and his Pan-Africanism, converge. Best known for his choral work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast of 1898, which became a staple of English choral music shortly after its premiere, Coleridge Taylor composed his characteristic piece for piano, 24 Negro Melodies, Opus 59 in 1905, reflecting a long-standing classical music practice of quoting folk music. This work consists of settings of African, Caribbean, and African American folk song. In the context of Victorian British history, 24 Negro Melodies can be understood as Coleridge Taylor's anti-war and anti-imperialist stance directed at British incursion into sub-Saharan Africa. In the various movements of this work, Coleridge-Taylor pays homage to his father, the surgeon, explores the African diaspora, again, in tracing the transatlantic slave trade, and makes this outright critique of British colonialism and Britain's involvement in wars on African soil. The majority of the source melodies for 24 Negro Melodies are African American spirituals. 16 are settings of these spirituals. One movement is a setting of a Caribbean folk song. The remaining 8 are African. One is Nigerian, the 7th, Olaba, which is in a Yoruba dialect and which can be linked to Coleridge-Taylor's father and grandfather, his father being a Sierra Leonean of Yoruba descent. The remaining African songs are drawn from Les Chants et les Contes des Baronga, an 1897 collection of folk tales and songs compiled by the Swiss missionary and ethnographer Henri Alexandre Junot. Next slide, please. Here we see 6 of the selections. The number 1, Luko Kitiga, a war song in Zulu about the coronation of a king. Number 2, Maribye, a children's song in Zulu. Number 3, Tata Nabanji, song of ogres who devour a woman. Number 4, Aba Boleke Nwasansad, a song sung by a woman who wanted a child. Number 5, Minjinjie, a song about frogs that accompanies a folk tale about a young man who marries a woman who turns into a unicorn, or trickery. And number 6, warrior song heard on Negro piano, or the mbira, in the country of the Barongo, played by natives. If we can listen to this excerpt, please. Thank you. When we examine the work as a whole, the African song settings and their titles, we see that Coleridge-Taylor traces in music the Atlantic slave trade from Africa through the Caribbean to the United States. After hearing African and Caribbean melodies, we arrive in the US and then hear what Pan-Africanism founder Du Bois termed the sorrow songs or spirituals. We also see Coleridge-Taylor engaging with anti-colonialism and imperialism and expressing opposition to the Anglo-Boer War. The Barongo are the Tonga, a Bantu people around the Delaware Bay in what was then Natal, the Transvaal, Rhodesia, and Mozambique. Coleridge-Taylor constructs a narrative about the fall of a kingdom in the African song titles, about the fall of a kingdom due to trickery that results in the loss of its children, its future. The framing songs are Zulu song about the coronation of a past king, number 1, and number 6, a warrior song, symbols of power and authority of the South African, Swazi, Transvaal, Zulu state and army. Framing songs of childhood innocence, nightmarish horror, loss, and duplicity. Together, they subtly critique British colonization of the Delaware Bay region and Zulu homeland, both of which had established kingdoms before the arrival of the Europeans. In this work, we can also perceive Coleridge-Taylor's engagement with Pan-Africanism, which began as he completed his studies in London. There, he came into contact with Africans, African Americans, and those of African descent from the Caribbean. He met the African American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar and set his works. For example, in African Romances for Piano and Voice in 1897. Through the writer Henry Louis Downing, He acquired a patron, the U.S. ambassador, African American John Hay, and began to learn about African American life as he moved increasingly among Black Americans. The composer also included a number of Africans, notably Sierra Leoneans, in his social circle. These new circles in which he now moved served more than a social purpose. For now he had found a community of Black men and women who not only offered their personal and professional friendships, but they also played a role in shaping his own identity and political viewpoint. In 1896, Britain was on the verge of the Second Boer War, which lasted from October of 1899 to May of 1902. This war centered on British presence in and control of the southern part of Africa and began as a struggle for the control over the bay in Mozambique, which was then a Portuguese colony. The region had long faced resistance from kingdoms and chieftaincies in the Zambezi Valley. Between 1885 and 1905, Portugal undertook 15 military campaigns in an attempt to assert sovereignty in the colony. Mozambican kingdoms, the Tonga, the Baru, and the Gorongosa people and the Shona of Zimbabwe drove the Portuguese from the Mozambique-Zimbabwe frontier in 1902, though the victory was short-lived. Ultimately, Britain and Germany secretly prevailed politically against Portugal through a secret treaty and militarily against the African kingdoms, and they divided Mozambique. In addition to colonizing the region, the Europeans engaged in an East African slave trade, which existed for much longer than the transatlantic slave trade, as slavery in Mozambique was abolished at the end of the 19th century. Coleridge Taylor always identified with and championed indigenous people, whether African American, Native American, Creole, Caribbean, or Barango and other Africans. This Black and indigenous consciousness led him to Pan-Africanism, as well as his position on British imperialism. Pan-Africanism, as understood today, began as a political movement in 1900 when Trinidadian British lawyer Henry Sylvester organized the first conference in London, July 23rd to June 25th at Westminster Hall. On the last day of the conference, the father of Pan-Africanism, W.E.B. Du Bois, delivered the address to the nations of the world, in which he first articulated one of his most famous statements, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the color line," close quotations, to an audience of Caribbean, African American, and a smaller number of African delegates. His remarks reflected the meaning of Pan-Africanism, the solidarity of Africans and those of African descent throughout the world, the fight against racism, color prejudice, and negative images, and self-determination for African nations. Coleridge Taylor attended this first Pan-African Congress, where he performed a setting of Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Corn Song. Coleridge Taylor also did other work at this conference in addition to providing music. Coleridge Taylor established a friendship with Du Bois, and Du Bois and his wife, and Du Bois often visited Coleridge Taylor at their home and attended a Crystal Palace concert of Hiawatha's wedding feast. The two forged a 10-year friendship, and Du Bois appears to have visited the composer during later trips to England. Now we begin to see how all this matters. When we listen to the warrior song, we begin to understand the subtext of imperialism, colonialism, war, and defeat, trickery, and slavery. Yet resistance for Coleridge Taylor was a friend of W.E.B. Du Bois, who not only identified racism as a global problem, but Du Bois also identified spirituals specifically and Black music broadly as the voice of the oppressed and the site of resistance. Portia Malsby brings us full circle in instructing us that Black music is a music of resistance. To go back to where I began, to ask that in this new Black Lives Matter, Black Music Matters world, that those who seek to program and perform Black music and to commission Black composers and to hire the Black ensembles, that they remember that the work of Black music, the matter of Black music is not just to entertain or to console, but also to do transformative work, to combat racism, to bring about liberation, even if only it celebrates Black love and Black joy, and that Black people continue to thrive. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very much, Gayle. That was a fantastic talk. Really, really, really interesting. We've got a few questions that are already coming in. There are so many things in here that we probably won't get time to think about all of them, but I'm going to read out some of the questions that have come in, Gayle.
Okay.
So the first one, it says, which musicians from current times do you think would be mentioned in this presentation if you were to do it again in 50 years' time?
Oh my. Well, here's the thing. I hope in 15 years' time, there's no need for me or whoever will be my counterpoint to even have to give this presentation, frankly.
That's very interesting, because we talked a little bit about, we have the Black Orchestra, Chineke Orchestra in the UK,
right.
And I think they're making a very important point. How long will they continue? Will they still be going in 50 years to prove that there are Black classical musicians out there? That's another question. And then also, I think this question's also thinking about the links between artists that you played at the beginning, like Kendrick Lamar and Monel, and how they relate to those early 20th century, late 19th century musicians.
Okay.
So I think that's where it's coming from.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting because first and foremost, I want to start with Mary Lou Williams, because one of the things that Mary Lou Williams did all throughout her life, and especially in the last 10 years of her life, she joined the Duke University faculty. And then there's also an early, I can't remember the exact date right now. I would have to come out of this and pull up the actual MP3 files, where Mary Lou Williams recorded a history of jazz and played the piano. And she developed what she called her jazz tree. And she also writes about this in her autobiography or her diary, because there are several drafts of her attempted autobiography, and then a notebook where she was handwriting, where she was preparing to write an autobiography. And at the root of her jazz tree, she had suffering, meaning the suffering of African Americans in slavery and the spirituals. And running up the side of the tree, on one side was the spirituals, and on the other side of the blues. Now, this relates directly to Mary Lou Williams, because as a child, she and her siblings used to hide under the bed and would listen to her parents, and especially her grandparents, who'd been formerly enslaved, talk about their experience of slavery. And she writes about one story that she heard them tell, and that she learned that when a slave was being disciplined, i.e. being lashed, being beaten, the people who were enslaved would begin to sing. They would begin to sing spirituals. So William and Mary so Mary Lou Williams always said that at the root of Black music is suffering, is that in Black music and Black culture came out of that experience of African Americans having been enslaved, and that is where the foundational musics, the music that was at the root of her tree, jazz and spirituals. And now, if you're a musician, or if you're the kind of person who loves to transcribe, and no matter what the majority of black music that we listen to today, that you can hear today, and you can go back and you can listen to Janelle Monáe and Hell You're Talking About, and you can go and listen to Kendrick Lamar, All Right. You can listen to a lot of rap and hip hop music today. You can go back and you can listen to all of the earlier music examples. What you'll hear running through all of those, and the blues and spirituals, in a sense, are two sides of the same coin. If I can get really, really technical, there's a couple things. You'll hear the so-called blues scale or minor pentatonic. That is the musical lingua franca of black music. That blues element, that blues feeling. And though you might not have the figures that say this is the blues, it is the blues. And also that spiritual element, that soulful element, that emotional core that runs through all forms of black music, even if it is not sacred music, and even if it's not the blues. We hear it in jazz. We hear it in the arrangements that Kendrick Lamar makes. And the other thing, of course, polyrhythm. These beats, and also those complex rhythmic layers, and of course, call and response.
I think that's really interesting, Gayle, in that, you know, every style is hybrid. And Robert Wyatt once said to me, I love the past because the past is the future.
Exactly.
You know, because even, you know, all of the musicians today are drawing on blues and jazz and aspects of soul and that feel that you're talking about there as well, that pervades particularly African American music. That we've been talking about a lot today, which kind of leads me into the next question, which is something that we've talked about, haven't we, about the differences between the US and the UK, the similarities, the shared histories, but also the differences. So the next question that's come in is, do you think black music's importance is different in the UK and the USA due to heightened racial consciousness and social injustices in both countries?
Wow, there's a lot to figure out. First of all, a significant number of, I am not an expert on the demographics in the UK, but to my knowledge, from what I've read and what I've studied and what I've learned, the population, the black population, the black British population in the UK originates in a variety of other places in many cases. For example, in the Caribbean and also in Africa. Both African nations and Caribbean nations, they have a common history and a common struggle, and that is the struggle against imperialism and colonialism. And they have fought for their political independence, as well as, if you know the history of the transatlantic slave trade, during one period in the slave trade, when the Africans were brought from the various African kingdoms and nations, they were brought to nations in the Caribbean, and where they were what was referred to as broken in or seasoned. And then they were brought from the Caribbean in the British slave trade. Then they were brought to the British mainland or the American colonies. So with respect to slavery, chattel slavery also being part of the histories of black Brits whose family or who they themselves, their ancestors originate from the Caribbean, they do share that in common with African Americans.
And I think, sorry.
Oh, so there are, even though, and then of course there are black Brits they're British born. So, but that is part of the heritage of many of the population of many, not all, but many black people in the United Kingdom, that they do share that history of their forefathers having been enslaved, or that history of their forefathers having to struggle against the slave trade, such as in Africa, as well as colonialism.
I think that those issues, Gail, are coming to the fore, particularly at the moment in the United Kingdom. And we have the historian David Olusoga, for example, doing projects and programmes, bringing to the fore Black history within the United Kingdom that hasn't actually been, that has been hidden or forgotten, and actually is very much part of that journey. So I think it is actually very timely, the things that we're talking about here. Which brings me to the next question, which is more kind of on the political side, in that we have, how are the current attacks on critical race theory in American political discourse affecting your ability to do your work and get funding as an academic?
Wow.
Yeah.
This is interesting because what the pushback, or it's kind of what we call a red herring, in a sense, in that what those who are opposing what they call critical race theory, they are opposing the teaching of critical race theory in the public schools. Well, it is not taught in public schools. Critical race theory originated in the late 1980s with Kimberly Crenshaw among legal scholars. And part of the reason for critical race theory is because there were judges, is to provide history of race and the legal justice system and in the United States, so that when judges sentenced Black men and women who came before them in their courts, they understood the how historically the criminal justice system had served as an arm of the state to oppress Black people and deprive them of their rights. For example, the chain gang. If you've ever heard that Sam Cooke song, that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. Well, at one point after the end of slavery, Black men doing nothing wrong at all could just be arrested and sentenced to prison, come before judge, innocent Black men, and be sentenced to prison and then sent to work on the chain gang, i.e. free innocent Black men could be deprived first of their freedom on false charges, and then deprived of their own liberty and their own labor, and in a sense even of their own autonomy and basically owning themselves, because that was also another form of slavery. And that called into question how the criminal justice system had been used not to protect Black men and women and children, but to oppress them and to enslave them once again in all but name only. And so there, as I said, once again, we see even in a popular song the way in which Black music calls out injustice in what is often used as a dance song, for example. That was a hit song in the 1960s by Sam Cooke. The so-called critical race theory that white conservatives are using or weaponizing is not critical race theory at all. What they are doing is attempting to eliminate the teaching of the history or anything they seek to be divisive. How does that affect not just my work, but also other Black scholars and scholars of color? I would say that it does. Well, right now, a number of my friends and associates, we have articulated concerns about how this will affect us. Historically, there has been a long history of projects pertaining to the study of Black people in all fields, whether we're talking medicine or the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities and the arts as well, not being very well funded or being turned down or not being highly valued by the academy or by other institutions. And of course, where I started at the very beginning of my talk, cultural institutions as well as higher education. So right now it's a cause for concern, because because the broader issue, the broader trend that's happening right now is a pushback and against the progress that has been made in terms of the creation of a large body of scholarship, a large body of music and art and plays and literature by Black creatives who also need funding. Um, and so this wave of extreme conservatism, under the guise of banning the teaching of critical race theory, which basically is a new form of 2022 whites, is asserting a way of asserting a new form of 2022 white supremacy, is a cause for concern for all of us.
I think that's really interesting, Gayle, in that I think a lot of the work of historians here and British Asians, in David Olusoga's case, British Nigerian, is really just about examining the country's past and revealing, and aspects of our history that perhaps some people would rather weren't revealed. And I think when you're talking about pushback, that's very interesting, because coming to terms with a history that's been embroiled in slavery and colonialism and imperialism is actually a very difficult thing, I think, to do in the United Kingdom. And I think the pushback has created I think politicians play with these, you talked about a red herring. I think the phony culture wars side of things in the United Kingdom is happening, where it's not actually being taught. So, I mean, I teach about African American music and history, and often students, it's the first time they come across it. They don't get taught it in schools at all. And I think it's such a rich history through music. So talking about your Stop and, the Chain Gang, immediately comes to mind for in England, not Benjamin Zephaniah, Linton Kwesi Johnson's Sonny's Letter. So we have, the previous question about the UK and the US is that we do have similar kind of issues that come from the same historical roots, but manifest themselves in different ways, which I think is really interesting. And from your talk, there's just so much richness there. We haven't got any more questions there, but I have got a question for you. Yes. In terms of music taught in higher education at universities. I think it's important that we do widen the curriculum. That's sometimes called decolonising the curriculum. In many ways, widening the curriculum for me means enriching the curriculum, bringing in all these wonderful artists and allowing young people to make the connections between a Billie Holiday and a Kendrick Lamar, or making those connections. So I think the other question that we had about in 50 years time, perhaps in 50 years time, do you think we could celebrate the richness of our multicultural Black music, British Asian, British and African American cultures? Perhaps in 50 years time, would we be celebrating all of this richness, or will we still be, like you say, fighting for freedom? And maybe have we got some optimistic kind of, like you said, I hope I won't be here, it won't be the same in 50 years time. What's your opinion? I'm
quite optimistic, primarily because in the United States, the country is diversifying. The demographics are shifting. So that the United States will be quite, it already is a diverse country, but the issue is who is sharing power, who is in the position where they make decisions about what gets taught, who are the deans and the chairs and the presidents of universities, or the principals of schools, or the superintendents of schools. and who are the orchestra directors, and so forth and so forth. And the important thing, and I think the pushback, sort of the extreme, the swinging of the pendulum in the opposite direction, is an attempt to sort of hold back the tide of change, because I think that in 50 years it won't necessarily be all the kids who are in grade school, or the teenagers and the college students who are diverse, but you don't see that diversity reflected in those who hold the power, those who are the deans. We don't see that quite right now. The presidents of universities or conservatories, but I believe that those who become the professors, those who head institutions, those who are not just the conductors but the artistic directors, will reflect the communities that they serve, and that's what I really think is going to happen. Because I mean, just looking back at history, when we think about, for example, I'm old enough to remember when you would only see one or two black characters on TV. And when there was one show, Julia, which didn't last very long, and that was one of the first shows that had a black woman as a lead character. And now, when you think about the fact that some of the most important and influential and transformative showrunners, writers, and directors, and not only in the United States but also in the UK, are black women, especially, and black men, who are creating content that speaks to a diverse audience, not just here in the US, but globally. So I know that time is coming when we'll see that, when we'll see the curriculum decolonize, and we'll see all of our institutions, our cultural institutions, where black music or black culture or bebop or Asian and Pacific Islander or other ethnic groups and people from other cultures won't just be tokenized. It will be it'll be like a buffet, part of our daily diet.
That's a brilliant place to finish. So a call for not tokenism, but engagement, sustained engagement for those, for people to get into those positions where they can control things. Your examples, Mary Lou Williams and W.C. Handy, and how they managed to control things despite all the racism they faced, with Mary Lou Williams hiring her own band, W.C. Handy running his own publishing company, through the music of Samuel Coleridge, Britta Taylor bringing in sort of ideas of anti-imperialism, Pan-Africanism. So through music as well as through speech, we can change the world. So on that note, I'm going to close this talk and say thank you very much to all of the events team, to Bethany Pryor, Claire Vidler, to Gayle especially for her fantastic talk, Emmeline Baker, Dave Turner, who are all part of the team. Thank you very much to everyone who's organised it, and a big special thank you to Professor Gayle Murchison for a fantastic, thought-provoking talk. Thank you, and do come to the next Inside Out lecture series. All the information is on the Leeds Arts Research Centre website. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I have so enjoyed being part of this.
It's a pleasure.